Hello, everyone. This section is sort of within money and marriage, and it talks about conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is really a topic I taught in personal selling or in sales, and I had students that were taking both classes and said that section would work really well in the money and marriage section in personal finance. And I thought, well, I might as well add that as well. So we'll dive right into this here. It was what I'm showing you and teaching here has been created based on a number of different tools, kind of a hodgepodge I put together, and it involves problem-solving models, negotiation steps, and conflict resolution models. And the reason that becomes important is because some people say, well, Bruce, that seems to maybe work in a business environment or employer environment, but not necessarily in a in a marital environment. And yet most conflict resolution models are very much the same in a business environment or an employer environment as it is in a home environment. It's the same thing. If you were to look at the North American Free Trade Agreement or negotiations in the Middle East, they're very similar models that are used in marriage. And that's what we're going to go through here. The reason this slide that I have up right now, it says the best places to practice are in marriage, relationships, and family. Now, the reason I say that is because usually you can practice in those environments, and if you fail at it, oh well, you'll have another opportunity. But the other reason I say that is because if you can start understanding in a marriage, a relationship, family environment, most people would say we have free choice in those environments, but maybe would say in an employer situation where you're an employee of a business or a company or organization, you don't maybe have free choice. And that's true to some extent, but it's also, if you look at it from the standpoint of the employer or a manager in that environment, that's not necessarily true, because you do have free choice to end the employment relationship in most situations. So there is some free choice, but the other reason I say that is because in those environments, if a manager were to manage a department or group of employees and just be sort of the authoritative dictator, if you will, and try to manage that department like that, they're not going to be very successful. Whereas if that manager looks at the employee and says they have free choice, and then try to manage the situation with some of these models and tools, the outcome is so much better. But again, the best places to typically practice this are in a marriage or relationship and a family. So this slide is pulled directly from my sales class, but I thought I'll just keep this in here. So again, it follows similar steps as problem solving and negotiation steps. One of the first things we'll look at doing is identifying conflict. Again, I put on D2L under content a handout that I give my sales students, and I would encourage you to use that handout in both the workplace in the future and with a spouse, because it's a quick and effective model. I actually created that not necessarily for my marriage, but as a quick cheat sheet to use when I'm in environments where I'm consulting, or if I'm on a board of directors or something like that. I've used those models in the past to help me, almost so I don't forget the steps to conflict resolution and negotiations. We all deal with conflict and negotiations, so to speak, every day in our lives, so why not get good at it? I know a lot of people have a fear of conflict and they dislike it very much. But once they learn these tools, you kind of get excited about using them to see if they work. And they usually do work. So the solution to dealing with conflict is I present and use what's called the Thomas Kielman instrument or conflict model. And then I do some follow-up if I'm in conflict to see if it in fact worked. So the first step, though, in using this model is identifying if in fact you have a conflict. Now, I'm going to pull up here a slide or the handout that you will have access to on D2L, and this is what it looks like. And one of the first things that you have to ask in identifying the situation is, am I in a conflict that needs a resolution? So to better understand this, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to hypnotize you now. So I want you to relax. Close your eyes if you want. You don't have to. But we're going to put you into a situation, and this is, in the past, has worked very well in the classroom setting for whatever reason. But here's what we're going to do. The other person in this situation can be a spouse. The situation can be a different situation. Maybe you and your spouse don't disagree on how to load a dishwasher. If you don't have a spouse or significant other, try to maybe input either a mother or father or a roommate or something like that. But I want you to picture yourself trying to work with that roommate or significant other to load the dishwasher. They want to do it their way, but to you, their way makes no sense. And again, for whatever reason in the classroom setting, I found that about 50% of students don't believe there is a correct way of loading a dishwasher, and about 50% of the students believe there is a correct way of loading a dishwasher. And that's why this makes for such an effective tool to figure out how to find resolution to the conflict. Now, here is the next part of this is I want, when you're dealing with that roommate or that other person, I want you to ask yourself, have you ever thought, oh, people are such idiots, or why can't this person just, why do they have to do it their way? Why can't they see my way is better? And, or have you ever said, why would you do it? Why would you do it that way? That's stupid. Okay. If you have ever said that, from here on today, and this is the hypnotizing part of this, I want you to immediately think Thomas Kielman instrument. TKI, Thomas Kielman instrument. Because what this will do is to help you learn how to overcome that conflict and hopefully make your life all the much better. So that's what we're going to get into next. Now, in that identification, the first question you have to ask when you're in a conflict is to ask, does this conflict need a resolution? And one of the things that I have listed on the model here is you would ask yourself, does it need a resolution? Now, we'll start if the answer is no. If the answer is no, then you might just be in a friendly debate. And let me give you an example of this. My wife and I do this to each other every once in a while. We'll argue maybe about some political situation or some policy decision at her workplace or my workplace where neither one of us are the decision makers, and we're not ever going to there is no purpose other than maybe having discussion or having a friendly debate on a topic. It might be whether or not England should have exited the European Union or something like that. Again, neither my wife or I are diplomats for the United States or congressional representatives or anything else. Our opinions are it's just a discussion. In that event where a resolution is not needed, now here becomes the important part, and you're in maybe a debate, and the other person, well, we'll get to that in a second. So there's no resolution needed. We don't need to worry about it. The next part to this is, are you in a conflict that in fact needs a resolution? There's tons of these. Loading the dishwasher would be a good example of this. Typically the answer would be yes, because you want clean dishes to eat off of. If the answer is no, then yuck. If you're okay eating off dirty dishes, I guess. I myself am not. So the question is, when dealing with the other person, is have they made up their mind? Do they think, in the dishwasher scenario, do they think that that is the only way to do it? And that means you are in fact in conflict. That, I'm going to use the dishwasher. My wife thinks there is a proper way to load a dishwasher. I don't think there is. I think if you, for the most part, load them in and dishes aren't touching and you hit the start button and put some soap in there, we're good to go. It'll get clean, and it's always the case where a few dishes never come out clean. That's my opinion. My wife, on the other hand, says no. The silverware goes in a certain way. To maximize the number of dishes that go in there, they need to go in a certain spot, so there is a correct way. We are in disagreement. Now, there still needs to be a resolution, but do we have conflict? And the answer is yes. That's a real conflict. In that situation, then, the next thing you need to go to is the Thompson-Kielman instrument. Let me scroll down here. That's what this is. Okay? And this is the different ways of how to handle the conflict. And we're going to talk more importantly about compromise and collaboration. Now, if we go back up here to look at this, now, in the situation, you've asked yourself, am I in a conflict that needs a resolution? The answer is yes. Has the other person made up their mind? If the answer is no, they have not in fact made up my mind, so my wife thinks there's a correct way to load the dishwasher, I'm on the fence about it. A couple times I've tried it her way, and I'll admit, the dishes come out cleaner. There's never those two dishes that don't come out clean, and maybe we get to use a easier cycle and save water or something. So I'm like, okay, maybe she has her case here. But I'm on the fence. I'm not sure. Well, in that situation, it would be appropriate then, or maybe a good time for my wife to try persuading me why her way works best. Okay? Now, this is very important to ask yourself mentally, has the other person made up their mind? Because if they haven't, again, persuasion can work. Now, if the other person has made up their mind and they think that their way is the right way to do something, and there's just no question about it, then if you start persuading that other person, the end result is you could anger that person. That is why it is so important that the person to ask, has the person made up their mind? Because if they start becoming angry, then what you start creating is competition. And those types of environments are fine, yet in 8 out of 10 scenarios, somebody in that conflict is not going to like conflict. So you're going to potentially anger that person and make it more comfortable. You're going to hurt the relationship. So again, we go back to this. Has the other person made up their mind? If they have not, then maybe try persuading. If they've made up their mind, then you go straight to this Thompson-Kielman model. Again, if they've not made up their mind, you can try persuading them. If you want to take personal selling that I teach in the normal semesters in spring and fall, I teach a technique called social styles and teach people how to use persuasion based on others' communication styles and sort of the psychology behind that. Unfortunately, I'm not going to teach you that here. You have to take another class with me if you want to learn that. Okay. Once again, though, if they've made up their mind, don't try persuading, convincing, or selling them on why to do something. You'll create that competition, which can lead to aggravation and aggressiveness, and it creates what's called a distributive environment. Okay? You don't want to create a distributive environment because in the long run, that goes against you and it starts hurting. So we don't want to create that distributive environment. And again, further persuasion often just creates anger and competition. So once you've identified if they've made up their mind and you are in fact in conflict, because yes, they have, then we go to this Thompson-Kielman model. Now, a couple of practical application tricks that I would advise and I suggest to students trying to learn to get good at this is to make a list of all the conflicts you're potentially going to encounter this year. Maybe you or your spouse are discussing where to go for Thanksgiving or Christmas. Maybe there's a salary negotiation, or you have a performance review at a certain time during the year. What I would encourage you to do is make a list of all the times where you're potentially in a conflict or problematic environment, and then set a reminder on your smartphone to review this Thompson-Kielman instrument right before you do that, or a week before you're in that conflict, so you can try using these techniques to overcome the situation. Now, once you use this Thompson-Kielman model, whether or not you're successful, reward yourself. If you're old enough, buy yourself a beer or 6-pack of beer, or whatever you want to do, but reward yourself in some manner, and then do it the following year again until this becomes habitual. In other words, it's becoming a good habit, and I think what you're going to find is it's a successful way of dealing with conflict, and people actually like doing this, and they like getting good at it when they start using it. So this is what the Thomas-Kielman instrument is, and it's 5 different ways of how to handle conflict. And the 2 dimensions that we look at here is, the first is assertiveness. And this is, your assertiveness is the idea of satisfying your own needs. And we have low levels of assertiveness and high levels of assertiveness. Well, most of us want to have a high level here because you want what you want. Then we have cooperation, and this is your level of concern in satisfying the other person's need. Well, if we were to flip this on its axis, wouldn't you say that wouldn't you want both people to have high levels here, and wouldn't that foster the best environment or best relationship? And the answer is yes. Now, if you were to read this in a textbook or read another instrument, what it's probably going to say is, because we see if we try to hit high here on both sides, then collaboration is the best way to handle conflict. Again, if you find this somewhere else, one of the things I'll probably say is there's no right way to handle all conflicts. And I would agree with that to some level. I would say, though, for the vast majority of us, it's more beneficial to us if we try to use collaboration in the long run. Most of us are not negotiating in, again, what's called a distributive environment. A distributive environment, if you think of litigation in a courtroom where you have 2 lawyers that are arguing, that's a distributive environment. Most of us are not in a distributive one-time situation case like a court litigation, okay? And knowing that, then our 2 best ways of accomplishing this are probably compromise and collaboration. So these are all, again, the ways of addressing the conflict. Now, the first way is, as we see on the graph, is avoidance. And avoidance essentially is neither party gets their way. We just avoid the situation entirely. And avoidance is always an option. But if we go back here, then you ask yourself, are you in a conflict that needs a resolution? If the answer is no, and avoidance is an absolute option, then you're fine. Then you're just having a discussion, okay? But for most of us, and for many situations, avoidance is not an option, or it hurts the situation worse. So the next option we have to handling the situation, if we did avoidance for the dishwasher scenario, we just wouldn't discuss it, and I would do the dishes my way, and it would just, or my wife would do it her way, or we wouldn't wash the dishes, and we wouldn't worry about it, and we wouldn't have the discussion. One of the problems, as you can see in that situation, though, is sometimes avoidance is applied in the wrong environment. In the dishwasher scenario is a good one to say, what's going to happen here in the long run if we continue to avoid communicating about this and just keep bickering? And you might harbor some anger and resentment there. The next situation, or the next way of handling the conflict, is to compete. Now, again, if we look at answering this above model, has the person made up their mind? and you use the strategy of competing, which is trying to get my way, and the other person again has decided and made up their mind, and it's an environment where there's free choice, you're going to again create an ugly distributive environment. You're fighting to get what you want and not taking into the account the other person's perspective. So the other person is often left feeling, a low level of cooperation. And if you're in a marriage or you're in a business environment where you are going to want the continual happy relationship, okay, but you're competing, at some point that relationship's likely to break down. So again, if the other person's made up their mind, competing is often not a very effective way. Now, another way to handle it then is accommodating. Now, accommodating can work in certain environments, and I don't know, I often kid the guys in my classes that your wife is always right, so just do what she says. And I say that tongue in cheek. I don't mean that all the time, and I don't mean that literally, because if you're accommodating to the other person all the time and they're never accommodating to you, what happens is you start doing something called scorekeeping. You take a subconscious checklist or something of how many times you've accommodated. And at the moment in time you start doing that, you start destroying the relationship. Okay, that's not a good thing to be doing. So that's why accommodation, again, you let them get what they want. Maybe you prevented the fight, but you're still not, the relationship still could suffer. So, on to the top here. With a dishwasher, accommodating would be me just, again, doing it with a dishwasher is I'll just do it my wife's way. Now, in reality, I try to do that, but it never works real well. So, my wife's usually not happy when I try to do the dishes. The next way to look at that would be to compromise. And that means I give a little and the other party gives a little. Okay, so we give in a little. Now that can work. The problem is that still has a distributive effect where, you're always compromising. You're giving in here and getting there. And I'm not saying it doesn't work. It very often can work. But over time, the reality is there's just a better way. And that's when you have a high level of assertiveness and a high level of cooperation. And that's when you collaborate. Okay. Now, again, this table here just shows how each one of these styles, which one's distributive and which one's integrative. And integrative is most successful when the importance of the issue, so this probably wouldn't work with a dishwasher, but maybe where to send the children to school or something like that. Collaboration is integrative, and it works well when the issue is very important. It also works best when the relationship is important. Now, in this day and age, there actually was a Harvard study done and looked at last 70 years or something, looked at graduates and people who were the most successful, the happiest, and they found it was those folks that had the best, highest quality relationships. So I would argue that if that's the case, that, if you want a happy life and relationships are important, then collaboration is the way to accomplish that. Relative power can kind of be between low and high. One of the parties might have a ton of power, the other one might have very little, or vice versa. Now, the one downside to collaboration is it does take a little more time. Okay, so that is one of the downsides to it. Now, I would say if the issue is important, though, and in my case with my spouse, I just treat it as, look, the relationship is most important, so I'm willing, and I think my wife is willing, to take a little more time to handle this, even with lower level importance issues, if we can both walk away and we've improved the relationship. So now that's that. So The distributive ways of handling conflict are compromising, accommodating, competing, and avoiding. And again, that describes the different levels. These are typically better in situations when there's not a lot of constraint. Competing may work well when the issue is important, but the relationship is not. So we can see in a marriage how competing is not very effective when the relationship's important, because when you're competing, you're putting the relationship last. So something to think about. And avoiding works well when the relative power in the household is equal. So collaboration is most often recommended because it has the fewest negative side effects. It creates a win-win environment and not a win-lose. The win-lose creates a distributive situation, and in business, in relationships, etc., you often don't want to create this. So when you're using these techniques, works fine in a courtroom, but maybe not fine in a marriage. So something to think about. Now, the one question you're going to want to ask or one thing to look at with collaboration is it's the only method that's recommended when follow-on relationships is important. It's often said, I never know when I need to work with this person again. Okay, and even in distributive environments like court cases or divorce or something like that, okay, you might have a great settlement where you got more in that situation, but are you going to have to work with this other person again in the future? Well, if you have kids, the answer would be yes. So would you want to create a distributive environment with this other person? And often the answer is no. It doesn't. It has no benefit if you do that. In fact, it has a lot of negative consequences. And in most situations, you want to create an integrative environment, not distributive, because you do not know when you have to work with that other person again. So what we're talking about when we compare distributive versus integrative environments is a distributive environment is when you're in conflict and you're trying to get your piece of the pie as big as humanly possible. Okay, that's what distributive is. Then we have an integrative environment. And what that situation does, instead of looking at how much of the pie you can get, it takes the two parties and says, how can we make a bigger pie? And when you look at the world in that way, the outcome is almost always better. You quit saying and sort of being selfish to say, how much of this can I get? And say, you know what, let's work together and create more. It's more effective. Now, obviously in certain environments, not all the time is the issue going to be integrative and you'll be able to use the integrative strategy. So that's when we have what's called a mixed method. And I don't know that I have any slides talking about this, but a mixed method or mixed approach would be first starting with an integrative framework to expand the pie as big as possible. Once you've done that, then you look at distributing it. But first you start with that. And that is really a problem-solving model that's applied in many environments. Last part then is following up and asking how both parties feel after the transaction. If one has negative feelings, then they may view the transaction as accommodating or competing or even compromising and not as collaborative. So you'll want to work with each other to say, okay, how could have we done this better so one of the people or one of the parties doesn't feel that way? Now, one of the things with the collaboration and integration is it's requiring that you identify the conflict before too much persuasion is ever used by either party. Again, when you start using persuasion before you've identified you're in conflict, you've already kind of started behind the eight ball. You don't want to get into a situation where you've persuaded, you tried to get your way, and that didn't work. So now you're going to try collaborating because the person's less likely to want to do so. So then we get into the steps to collaborating. We're actually going to look at how it is you collaborate. Step one, you define the problem. For starters, you focus on the task, not the person. When you're focusing on the person, odds are you're going to either attack the person or you're going to try to butter them up in a way that's going to be obvious. Okay, so instead, look at the task, look at the problem. Stay away from any words or verbiage that comes across as, well, if you weren't in this situation, we wouldn't have this problem. Because that's true, but in this world, unfortunately, if you want to be and live and work around other people, you're going to have to deal with other people and their wants and desires. So in that case, it behooves us to focus on the task, not the person. Focus also on the problem, not the symptoms of the problem, not all the other that goes on or the consequences and the other things that are happening because of the conflict. Focus on the problem that's causing the conflict. The next part of that is determining each person's desired results. What is the end result? You start with the end, start at the beginning with the end in mind. What is your desire and want? Now, I love this part of collaborating because my wife and I used to think that we oftentimes disagreed on certain situations, but when we frame this out to say, what is the end result you want, usually we find we're almost in perfect agreement. Maybe it's whether or not we should take one of our kids to the doctor. I could tell you a funny story, a number of funny stories about taking kids to the doctor, but I'll save you. I won't do that. But if we start off with that situation and say, what's your desired result? I'll usually say, I want a happy, healthy child. My wife will agree and say, I want the same thing. Okay. Then we get, how do we get that? How do we get there? If we looked at the dishwasher scenario, our desired result would be, I would say, I just want clean dishes. My wife would say she too wants clean dishes, but she also doesn't want to waste water, and to have the ability to put more dishes in there so that doesn't happen. I'm fine with that, and I don't have a problem with that. It's not good to be wasteful. I can agree with that. So again, if you start with the end in mind, then you get agreement on what desired results you want. Typically, not always, but typically. The next step is, okay, we've figured out the results that we want. Now, let's come up with all the different options we can come up with to handle that, to figure out how to get to that. So if we use the dishwasher scenario, maybe some of the alternatives would be to use paper plates. Maybe it would be to eat on the floor. Now, I know some of you might be laughing and saying, what? The purpose of this step is to generate alternatives no matter how maybe stupid you think they are. And this is the tough part. Don't judge them. Your job in this step is to not judge. It's just simply to come up with alternatives. Now, once you've come up with a number of alternatives, okay, that's when we're going to start reviewing them. Then you evaluate the alternatives and select the best option that meets the desired result that both of you want. The idea is to look at win-win scenarios or situations. So neither party should dominate the creation or selection of the alternatives because you're trying to create a win-win environment. Then, step 4, you implement the choice. And the last step, if you'd like, is to evaluate and feedback. Check the effectiveness of the alternate or the choice that you chose. Benchmark it if possible to see if this in fact worked and how is this conflict resolution model working with these conflicts. Now, one of the things I want to say is once you get good at this, it actually takes very little time, especially in a marriage, to come up with this and implement it and do it. It can be almost any problem, and you can say, okay, quick, let's start with the end in mind. What do you want? You say that to the other person. They say, this is what I want. Usually you say, okay, I can live with that. This is what I want. Okay, then let's come up with a couple alternatives. You do that. You take 5 minutes. And 5 minutes is worth it to create an environment where you're removing conflict, especially when conflict is not desired by either person. Other thing you can look at is compare the desired results. Maybe look, would have another alternative been better? make adjustments if needed, and try again. Again, if we look at the handout you have, so this is what you start with. Am I in a conflict that needs a resolution? If no, then you're probably just in a friendly discussion or debate. If the topic does or the conflict does need a resolution, ask yourself, has the other person made up their mind? If the other person hasn't made up their mind, go ahead and maybe try persuading a little bit. Now, if the answer is yes, the other person has made up their mind, then you're probably in a real conflict, and that's where we need to jump into the Thompson-Kielman model. I would start with collaboration, regardless of the situation. You know, some couples do like debating, and that's fine if you're like that, but typically one party or one partner does not like the debating as much. In that case, again, collaboration is the best way to handle it. Once you're there, you start going through the steps of this, define the problem, generate alternatives, evaluate and implement the evaluate the alternatives, create win-win, implement the alternative or the choice, then do evaluation and feedback. This doesn't have to be a complex way of handling a situation. It can be a very quick way of doing it. You don't have to go through step 1, 2, and 3 once you've practiced and done that. Now, again, the benefit of doing this in a marriage is you're much more likely to start doing this in the workplace environment. That's where you'll see a lot of benefits, and that is collaboration, I believe, is the #1 skill most employers say their employees lack, is collaboration. Now, when people read those types of articles, what they don't know is collaboration means something very specific. And what it's talking about in collaboration is the Thomas Kielman instrument. We're not talking about, just getting along with people in the work world or getting along with your spouse. It's talking about a set step work framework of accomplishing something that creates strong relationships and folks that are overall relatively happy. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you in the next video.